Well, hello and welcome back to Early Childhood Chats. Hey, we're in season 2 now of our podcast, and we thank you so much for joining us. Today, I am with, honestly, one of my favorite people out there. Worked with Tara for many, many years, and finally got the chance to hang out with her in person. It was in Puerto Rico, so that was nice. But Tara, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you. Autism's Little Learners. You're the founder, the brainchild behind it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so excited to be here and to get to see your face and talk to you 2 months in a row is pretty exciting.
So you have been just a powerhouse of information and resources and support to really all teachers. I mean, early childhood and even beyond, looking at, ways that we can better navigate the very complex system of autism and folks that are challenged and all sorts of issues out there. And I just can't say enough wonderful things about the great work that you do. Can you give folks a sense of your background, how you started doing what you're doing, why you're so passionate about this work that you're in?
Of course. So I'm a speech language pathologist. My minor was early childhood education. So I've always had a heart for the littles, those 3 and 4-year-olds. But my first half of my career was at the elementary level, and then the second half was at the preschool early childhood level. And I have worked with autistic kids my entire career. And it's kind of funny because I remember all of us in college, undergrad and grad school, I think all the way through, we had one course where maybe one unit was on autism. So it was like just a very, very general information. We did not walk out of grad school with any real knowledge of how to work with autistic kids. So when I was doing my student teaching, I was like, there were a couple autistic kids in the class, and I was really nervous. I don't know, like autism just seemed like a very scary thing. And then I met these little 3 and 4-year-olds, and that's when the passion started. I was like, okay, I had to learn how to work with them, how to connect with them, just kind of by instinct and gut. And so that's where my passion started. And back then, when we're talking visual schedules, they were literally Polaroid pictures. It was in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And so they had like work with Tara, and it was a Polaroid picture that they Velcro on a visual schedule. And I just remember leaving that student teaching experience being like, okay, I want more of this. I love working with autistic kids. And so my first job right out of the gate was running an elementary-based autism classroom. And so rather than me being a speech therapist that pulls kids in one-on-one or small group, I have gotten to run a classroom that has a communication-based classroom, and continue to do that for my whole career at elementary and then early childhood. So it's kind of funny how you can go from something where you're a little nervous or have no idea what to do, and it becomes like the passion of your life.
well, well, it's a fantastic story, and the passion, just shines through. And I always have a smile anytime we get the chance to connect or email. I look like a goof. I'm sitting here smiling when I get emails from you, just so you know. But I mean, it's really interesting to see kind of how much autism has changed just in our lifetime, right? I mean, I think back to
Mhm.
the late 70s, early 80s, even the 90s to some degree. I feel like you didn't hear a lot about autism, and you certainly didn't have the kind of training and support and resources that are out there nowadays. So, I mean, I guess for many, like in many cases, you were kind of forging a path kind of on your own here, weren't you? I mean,
Yeah, you're right with that. So, autism is relatively new when you think back to the history of the United States and the world. And it really was only first identified in, I think it was the 1950s. And then they continued, more discovery research in the 60s. And then I think it wasn't until the maybe mid 1990s, if I'm right, if I'm remembering right, that it was added to IEPs as an educational label. And so, like, that's well within our lifetime, like that was actually not very long ago. So, autism is relatively new when we think about learning about it in general, how we define it, and then certainly how to educate kids in the schools, in early childhood, in Head Start, kids who are autistic.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of definitions because I certainly I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I know it's changed a lot over the years.
Yes.
So kind of steer me in the right direction here. How are we discussing what's the and again, we don't want to put labels on people or do any stigma or do any kind of I don't know, bullying or anything like that. So
Yeah.
what is the kind of the correct terminology that we're using in 2025 nowadays?
And Andy, you're absolutely right. Things with terminology have changed in the 26 years that I've worked with autistic kids. So, back when I started, I think years ago, many years ago at the beginning, they used the word autistic. And then I don't know, it was probably in the 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s, they were like, okay, nope, you have to say child with autism. So person first language. And that was ingrained in me throughout my early years of teaching. And everyone said, he has autism. He's a child, a boy with autism. And then this has changed in like the last 5 years because there's been the neurodiversity movement with autistic adults who have spoken up and said, you know what? Autism isn't something we can set aside. It's not like something you carry like a bag and you can be with it or you could be without it. Okay. So
Right.
that's kind of how autistic adults explain it. And many of us as professionals and clinicians are really, really listening to what autistic adults have to say because it can guide us to know which things are helpful and which things are hurtful and even traumatic. And a piece of this is what do they want to be called? And so they said it's part of who they are. When someone has, let's say, epilepsy, they say epileptic, so it's something that is part of them. That's how it's been explained to me by an autistic adult and what I've read from others. So they prefer the term autistic. And for a lot of us that spent so many years saying, oh my gosh, it's really bad if someone says autistic, we should say with autism. That is so ingrained that it's hard to even get it out of your mouth and say it. And so I've made that shift now. There's lots of things in the autism world that we're starting to make this shift with. So I default to autistic, but if there's an autistic person who wants to be referred to as with autism, totally fine. So people now tend to be defaulting to saying the child is autistic unless otherwise specified. And one other thing about the history, um, when I started teaching in 1996-ish, 97, student teaching, the prevalence of autism was about 1 in 500, if not a little more. And now it's 1 in 36. So
Wow.
that's how much things have changed and why we're seeing more of it.
Holy moly.
Hmm.
So is that, and I know that there's been some talk about, vaccine. Oh, there's just
Hmm.
crazy stuff that gets said all the time, right?
Yeah.
What is the reason that we're seeing from 500 to now 1 in 36? Is that better diagnosis, better testing, more awareness? Is there some kind of measurable increase that maybe we don't know where it's coming from or what? I mean, I have no idea. So
Yeah.
I'm just
Well,
curious.
having no idea, you kind of hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
So, back in my early teaching years, vaccines were being blamed huge, huge, huge. All of the research that's out there does not show evidence of vaccines and autism being related to vaccines from what we know right now. So we can kind of take that out as maybe a myth right now. Who knows in the future what people will find? But it is like the definition of autism and the criteria has broadened. So if you think back, autism was thought to be mostly people like Rain Man, right? In that
Sure,
movie,
right.
where, they're either nonverbal, limited verbal, savants in some areas. And that was the definition of autism. And now it's broadened quite a bit more. And so you might have kids that are talking, 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 but they have deficits in areas like the pragmatic, the social communication, and have some of those sensory needs or restricted interests. So that's where things have changed. So it's broadened. There's more awareness. We're doing more testing, but also there's just more and not exactly sure why if it's environmental. We know there's a genetic component, but the environmental piece, we're not sure what that, or people aren't sure what that's about or what that entails.
And I want to do another definition if you'll allow me. So, you
Mhm.
hear people, I'm on the spectrum, or I think the
Mhm.
child that like, is that still valid? Are we still talking about spectrums? I mean, I know Elon Musk even says spectrum and I've got autism
Yeah.
and all this stuff. So I'm just curious again, what is spectrum something we're still using and what
Yeah. I
exactly does that
still,
mean nowadays?
yeah, I actually still hear that a lot. So in
Okay.
the medical model of diagnosing, so you can get a medical diagnosis from doctor, neuropsychologist, psychologist, or an educational label. And the educational label depends on what state you're in, but it's either autism or autism spectrum disorder. And I think that term was brought about to kind of talk about that spectrum. It's not just like this one type of kid with these small set of characteristics. It's very much a spectrum. But I think now they're not talking low to high functioning. That used to be, oh, they're very low functioning or they're high functioning. And now they talk more as to how much support the person needs. Because sometimes being very verbal, you would think, oh, that means high functioning, but they might not be functioning very well in their everyday life. And so, how much support do they need? So, we might say, oh, I have a child who has high support needs, meaning they need a lot of help from us. And then someone might have low support needs, they're a little more independent. So, those are kind of some of the terms that I've seen change over the last 25 years. But I do hear people say on the spectrum still, and I think I haven't heard autistic adults say, okay, this is bad. We should not have this. I think it's preference on the person, what they'd
Well, I
like to.
mean, it makes sense. I mean, look, there's all of us are on some spectrum of some sort, whether this impacts us a little bit or a lot of bit or whatever. So I guess the term does make some sense. And certainly,
Mhm.
I mean, autism is one of those things, from my understanding, that it's very much a person specific
For sure.
how it manifests itself, right? I mean,
Yeah.
some, like you said, some are very nonverbal, some need a lot of extra support, others are very verbal, and maybe they don't need as much support or vice versa.
Yeah. And then you look at the sensory differences and the behavioral challenges might be a little bit for one kid and a lot for another. And so when you're kind of looking at all these areas that might be affected, that's why they say, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Because I think that's what can be so confusing too for parents, caregivers, teachers, family members is that they might have met an autistic kid and then in their mind that's what autism is and then they say, well, my child's not doing that. My child gives me hugs and is warm and loving and they think that maybe excludes them from being autistic based on what their experience is. And so every child is different with a different set of characteristics.
And we're obviously talking to early childhood professionals here, kind of 0 to 5 age range for the
Mhm.
most part, some 0 to 12, of course, too. Is there any studies, science, or just experience, like how young I mean, I would think a child probably has to be somewhat verbal. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. How young do you kind of start detecting that, hey, maybe this child does have autism? Is there an age, or is it just kind of each one is unique?
What's interesting is with the right testing and the right people that are well versed in it, kids can be diagnosed as early as 18 months.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So,
That is
yeah,
super young.
and I have
Wow.
several people I know who have an autistic child, and then the sibling they want to for sure keep tabs on due to the genetic component, and they have gotten that diagnosis at 18 months. So, one of the big things that is kind of one of the other things, okay, got to back up here. One of the other things that is out is calling these things red flags. right? We
Okay.
can call them indicators. That's much nicer. Red flag sounds like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to die. There's a catastrophe.
Right.
And, imagine if a characteristic that described kind of who you are and how your brain works, if people considered those red flags, you
Yeah, that's
think
not good.
future, it's not very nice, right?
No.
And we're just so used to saying that. I don't think people mean it in a bad way, but that's one of the language things that's shifting. So indicators of autism at a young age, like 1 year old to 18 months, if the child is not using gestures. Now, remember, one characteristics like this in itself it does not equal autism. It's kind of a conglomeration, putting the pieces together of like, okay, now we have several things. This really is leading us to that diagnosis. But one can be not using gestures. So you see me, I'm on the screen, I'm using gestures all the time.
Right.
But for little kids, it might be, clapping, yay, waving bye, doing a little shrug. You could probably think of your own 1 year old and think of
Right.
all these different, they maybe don't have any words yet, or they're not using words yet along with it, but they have all these gestures. Could be a thumbs up, pointing. I'm trying to think of what little kids do. Yeah, like waving bye-bye. So if you're not noticing them using any gestures or very few gestures, the rule is 18 gestures by 18, or sorry, 16 gestures by 16 months,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
16 different gestures. So that's something kind of tangible that childcare providers and parents can use. One of the big things is think of your kids when they were young, before they could probably even talk, they started using that little pointer finger and they would point either to something that they wanted or like think if there's an airplane in the sky and they point to it and they look at you and they look back.
What
So they're
is that?
communicating like,
Right.
there's an airplane. Do you see it? Because I want to share this, what I'm seeing with you. But they don't have to say one word, but you know exactly what they're talking about. And you're like, oh, airplane. So this piece of even it's called a 3-point gaze. And so they're looking at that, looking at you, looking back. And so you have the 3-point gaze along with the gesture, and that's like gold. That's typical development one-on-one by 18 months. So I think those are really big things. A lot of times with autistic kids, when they're young, people might think that, oh, I think my child might be deaf, or a child care provider might say, oh, I wonder if they should have their hearing tested. They don't respond to their name, or they don't look at me when I call for them. And that's not typical. Or if there's like loud noises, maybe they don't even look. And so a lot of times, and rightly so, first thing would be to get their hearing tested just to be sure. But if the hearing test comes back normal, that can be an indicator because it's that joint attention and responding to name. One other thing that you might see at early childhood is the child might, we call it hand leading. And so, like using someone's hand as a tool. So maybe they could go over and grab the thing that they want, but they take the adult's hand and bring them to the thing and put their hand on it as if to request, like, hey, can I have that? And it's a very, hand leading is very unique to autism. And I've had it happen so many times with students. Or if they want something open, they take your hand, bring you to it, put your hand on it, or put your hand on the cupboard or the refrigerator. So those are a few tangible things. And there is a website that it's the Autism Navigator, and I can send you the link to that. So you can put it in the show notes for people because that has a printable list of the 16 gestures by 16 months.
And it sounds like there's obviously some, I don't even know the right word, interpersonal, introspective kind of, expressing myself, kind of overt signs. Is there, and again, you're 1 year old, you're not expected to do too much crazy socialization, but certainly after the 1 year mark, you start playing with other kids to some degree.
Mhm.
Is there any kind of indicators that would kind of have to do with peer interaction or working with others or those types of things?
Yeah, I think a lot of times our autistic little ones, toddlers, you'll find them playing on their own, or maybe not even playing with toys. Maybe they're playing with toys in unique ways. And so there, sometimes we used to say our students are very object focused versus
Mhm.
people focused.
Hmm.
So it's not like they're not playing with kids in a certain way. They just might seem oblivious or not notice that they're there and more focused on their thing that they like. So if they love trains, they're just so focused on that and just don't seem to notice other kids. So a lot of times, even parallel play can be difficult because if a child comes and disrupts the way that they like to play with toys, whether they're spinning something, lining trains up, um, playing with objects or toys in a real particular way, they may react negatively to someone coming and taking a piece of that. And so a lot of times I'll see students turn, if this child's coming up this way, kind of turning and protecting their turf and their things. And so that's more what I see at that age for that lack of social interaction.
Well, certainly we have a whole host of people, everybody from family child care providers to your kind of traditional center based to religious based to Head Starts and on and on. Obviously, we all have really, really different levels of support that we can provide. And I know that you're dealing with it. And I hope that you talk about, kind of the I almost call it a support group for lack of a better term, the network that you have established and the educators that you work with, because I think that's something that's just amazing. And I hope a lot of people here take advantage of it. But how are folks, again, I'm in rural Minnesota, I'm in rural Wisconsin, I don't have access to leading experts and all this. How are early childhood providers kind of dealing with these issues? How are they trying to get help? How are they trying to, make sure that they're providing the most loving and supportive environment that they can when maybe they don't have access to a lot of the same resources that others do?
Well, I think in walks the beauty of the internet and social media because this has become my passion is being able to connect with people who maybe are from these small rural areas that don't feel like they have support. And we always talk about special education. We feel like an island, many of us, where maybe you're the only one doing the thing that you're doing. And I suspect that a lot of times childcare providers, Head Start providers feel somewhat the same way, but with even less support. Because if you're in Head Start, if you're in a childcare center, if you're a parent at home, you might not really know anyone else who has an autistic kid that they're taking care of. And so you literally are like, I am alone. I don't know who to talk to about this, and I don't know how to make it better. I don't know how to make transitions smoother or make the day better. And in childcare settings with 3 to 5 year olds, a lot of times you're the first to kind of go, oh, I think there's something different about how this child's developing. And I think with more awareness on social media, people might be aware of some of the indicators of autism now. And so you might, as a childcare provider, even say, "Ah, I'm kind of getting a gut feeling like this child maybe should be checked to see if they're autistic. But I don't know where to go or what to do." And so I think joining a group of people that can help walk you through, that's why I have several kind of free options. One is learning about topics through the Autism Little Learners podcast. One is a Facebook group. It's called, oh gosh, I don't want to say the full name of it wrong, but it's Visual Supports. I think something like for preschool autistic kids. We will put that in the show notes. I'll give you the link so you get to
I'm a
the
member
right
of
one.
that one. I got that one for sure.
Visual Supports, because
Yes.
that one, we have over 50,000 people in that free group now, and it's just a place you can come to lurk and learn. I just came up with that. It's just a good term. A lot of people don't like to jump in and post right away, and that's okay. You can learn from other people posting, but it's a great place where you can post like, hey, I'm in a Head Start setting, and I think two of my students are autistic, but we have no support, no diagnosis yet. What can I do? And you will have other people that have been there before you or are doing it now that can help with practical, realistic advice. One of those people is me, but then there's just so many people out there that might be in your same position. So those are two really great places to start for free information. And I also have a free set that I call the Visual Support Starter Set, and that has been implemented in Head Starts, childcare, home, school, and it's things, visual supports that I found over 25 years have been the best with a variety of kids in a variety of settings, autistic kids. And so it's things like the all done bucket and the first then board. And there's this star chart that counts time down, and a starter visual schedule. And you might be saying, if you're new to this, like, wait, slow down. I don't even know what you're talking about. So what you want to do is download this, and then you can learn about each of those things and how they can help and why. And that can be found at www.autismlittlelearners.com/visuals. And that is a really great place to start if you're like, I don't know what resources to start with to help. And transitions, it's a huge thing I talk about because everyone deals with difficulty with that with autistic kids.
Well, and we did work, many years ago. We made a bunch of social stories
Yeah.
on emergencies and disasters and fire drills and active shooter and all these things that, I mean, sadly are part of life. And I've been just, I mean, the response, I've been blown away. I mean, obviously we started off talking about autism and we did this with that in mind, but I got to tell you, they've been received. I mean, who doesn't love a good social story, a picture book and
Right?
stuff, right? I mean, the kids love them. They just go crazy for them. And it's, I'm just so proud of the work that we've done.
Yeah.
That's been years now. Um, but I
I'm
think there's,
actually, oh, sorry.
no, no, no.
I'm
There's
so
just,
glad you mentioned it.
oh, I mean, there's just really something special about seeing it in a visual way.
Hmm.
And I know, and when we talk about it in the emergency setting, we say, look, if you're doing a drill, why don't you show this book, walk through it, explain it ahead of time, go do the drill, and come back and do it again and talk about what did we just do and why did we do it and do you have questions and following up. And the teachers over the years that have done the approach and used the materials, I mean, it's so cool to go across the world and go into different childcare programs and you walk into a classroom and like there's the book hanging up on the wall.
Oh,
Oh, we use this all the time. It's so cool. So what is kind of the secret sauce there? How did you come up with these visuals? How did you first like, wow, this is really a good supplemental. This really helps people. Like what's the reasoning? What's the logic, the science kind of behind the visuals?
yeah. So there's, when you talk visual supports, you're talking such a wide range of different things. It could be a visual schedule showing what's coming next, or the all done bucket. But specifically with social stories, I'm so glad you mentioned this, Andy, because that is where we met and how it started for us getting to know each other. And it's such a huge piece on my website. I have this free story library where you can go in and there's dozens, including the stories Andy's talking about for fire drills, tornado drills, wildfire, hurricane, active
Yeah.
shooter,
Earthquake. We did an earthquake
earthquake. I
one.
was going
Yeah.
to say, what are we missing?
We did
Earthquake.
COVID. We did COVID.
Yep,
Yeah.
tons of COVID stories from
Right.
from 2020. But the thing with social stories, they were developed by someone named Carol Gray, and she did mostly written with maybe some pictures here and there of kind of what's going to happen and keeping them positive. It's not a list of like, don't do this, don't do that. So she has a very specific formula of what type of sentences you write. So my free stories are kind of a play on that, but for that early childhood, early elementary population, having pictures on each page is really, really helpful in keeping it very simple. So a story of what does a fire drill look like? We're going to line up. We're going to walk in a line. We're going to go out the door, just kind of putting in place exactly what to expect, and then we come back in. Like that can be the hard part for some of my students. But like you said, these help with everybody. Anytime I've had, whether it's a social story or some kind of visual support or visual schedule in an integrated classroom with typical kids, they all want to look at it too. Like everyone likes the feeling of knowing what's coming and what's going to happen, and it relaxes everybody. The anxiety goes down. And so I think, like you said, this can be used with all kids, a lot of these strategies. But the social stories in particular, on my website, autismlittlelearners.com, there's a whole section, and you can go and download those at absolutely no cost. Those are always going to be free. And so it's something I would encourage you to explore. But research has shown through Carol Gray's work that goes back to the early 90s that social stories are an evidence-based practice for autistic kids. And so, meaning there have been studies that they work. And it is exactly what you're saying, like being proactive and kind of foreshadowing, letting them know what's coming before, and then you pull it out and use it during also. And then if cognitively, with the students that are cognitively able to understand, like after you're done coming back to it and talking about it, it can be just so, so helpful and actually paramount in making a smooth transition for things like the fire drill, which can turn into chaos if you have kids who have trouble with transitions, have trouble with change, and all of a sudden you have like the most major change. Okay, stop what you're doing suddenly, and we're going to go outside a different way, not to the playground, like talk about throwing a schedule off. And then we have students who wander or elope, they run away. And how scary that is for the adults that are with them to ensure that we can do a fire drill safely. And so there's a whole lot of other things that go into it along with that story. I was telling Andy before we hit record, specifically with fire drills, we made sure that we had a, depending on our class that year, a wagon or two nearby because we knew which kids would do better if we had them in a wagon, holding on to a toy or something they liked, and they weren't walking out on their own because that flight risk is really, really frightening.
Mm. Well, and even I know some children are really bothered by the fire alarm, which
Oh, yeah.
look, I get it. I mean, we do it during nap time. We do, it's crazy. These fire drills have gotten nuts, right? Who wants to be woken up from a nap with a screaming fire alarm going off? But,
Oh,
and I get the approach. And I would even say I would encourage the first couple times of the year, if you know you have children that are sensitive, don't use the real fire alarm. Simulate something. Now, it is important eventually that they know what the sound is, so they know what it means. But I don't think you have to jump in at this 100 miles an hour. I mean, we do it every month. You got all year. And I know some states are going to argue with that and say, well, the rule here says you got to use the fire, which I get. But look, there's
mhm.
nothing saying you couldn't do two fire drills and maybe do a practice
Yeah,
one before the real one, right? But,
right.
you
Well, and
know,
what you're saying is something in kind of newer terms is being neurodiversity affirming. We want to, the goal of the fire drill should not be to throw a child into dysregulation and a meltdown that they can't recover from for the rest of the day, right? And then every time they walk in, they're scared. And I mean, it can really lead to some big issues. I know at the elementary level, I was so lucky because our principal understood this back when not everyone did. And she would always at least give our classrooms a heads up and say, okay, it's going to happen at this time. You can choose to be outside at that time, because then you're away from that loud alarm. Or we could try to have headphones on the students who really, noise reducing headphones, the students who really, really would have become dysregulated by that. And I always said with little kids, like, okay, it's going to be on us to get the kids out of the building anyway. And so whether they hear the alarm or not, because a lot of our kids who do have those high support needs at that young age, they're not going to equate yet this alarm means I need to go out.
right.
And I certainly wouldn't want them to, hear the alarm and run out the door without an adult either. So it's kind of this, you're in this losing situation when you have autistic kids and you have this fire alarm issue. And so if you have someone that's able to work with you and still stay within the guidelines, or even like you said, could we practice it a couple times before the actual fire alarm? Yeah, it's a hassle to have to do it a couple more times, but it's a good way of thinking, Andy.
I wonder in all the conversations you've had, I'm sure that there's been a time where you're working with a teacher and they see some of these signs and I mean, look, a lot of the kids, they're with the teaching staff more than they're with their parents, at least when
Mhm.
we talk about waking hours, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, the conversation where I'm a teacher, I notice some things. I obviously want to bring it to the parents' attention. And I've got to think that occasionally that's a really difficult conversation. Now, maybe it's getting better, but gosh, you think back to like again the 80s, the 90s, even the 2000s, and
Mhm.
I'm sure probably still today in some cases. But have you had any stories or any kind of experiences where like the parents are just in, I don't want to hear it, and I'm in denial, and yeah, I'm sure there's
For
some stuff
sure.
that went on like it. It's got to be kind of a difficult situation to be in, I would think.
Yeah, and I think especially if you are a childcare provider, not a special educator, because even special educators who work solely with autistic kids still have a hard time bringing it up. Like, let's say they get a new referral and they're doing testing for some people who this is what they do, it's still hard for them. Like I've heard so many people say, like, how do I bring this up? How do I bring it up? So if you are childcare provider, Head Start provider, don't do it alone. I wouldn't go solo on that. I would go to your director, whoever is your boss or who you answer to and discuss it because they might want to bring it up themselves or observe. And so I would kind of talk to someone like that first, and maybe they would be with you while you bring it up. If it's something that they're like, yeah, you should bring that up to parents. I would think a lot of times they would do it with you because, it's you can do a referral, I think in most states. You might even know this, Andy, for Head Start anyone can do a referral for special education. In Minnesota, there's a website called Help Me Grow, and anyone, childcare provider, anyone can make a referral for a child on there for a special education evaluation or at least a screening. However, if you make that referral, you probably want to talk to parents first. So either way, whether you're able to kind of anonymously do it, they're going to know it came from the child care because I think that's what it would say on there. So I think, yeah, talk to your director and see if you guys could have that conversation together and then help the parents find the next steps. Like, depending on what state, some states you go to the county if they're under 3. Um, and so you just have to check where you would do that initial special education evaluation. And I would think a director would know that in most states, but that's kind of the process I would go through because you don't want to, for families who maybe had no idea, or maybe they did, but they aren't ready to go there. You don't want to wreck your relationship with them since you're caring for the child every day. So doing it with somebody is always the easiest. But I have had that, even though, we say when let's say I get a new referral and we're talking with the parents about what everyone has been seeing. And usually if they were referred to me and Terry, the special ed teacher that I was with at early childhood, it meant autism. We're adding that autism piece into the evaluation
Mm.
specifically. So we always had to talk about that because you have to explain the tests that you're going to be doing. And most people, I don't think I think maybe twice in the last decade, I've had someone say, no, we're not testing for that. You can test for all the other things, but not that.
Wow.
And that's okay. They can deny it. They can deny testing in that area. And what we have to remember is, okay, in the evaluation, we're going to find the child's strengths and their needs. And whatever label they get, we're still going to address their needs and their strengths. So I wouldn't get hung up. I've had a couple students in the past that were in my classroom, which was an autism classroom, strategies only, specifically for autistic kids. So the parents were okay with them being in my classroom, but didn't want that educational label. And so maybe they were under speech language or developmental disability, and it was fine. Like we just used approaches that worked for their child, and it didn't matter what it was called.
And I know this is a little maybe hard to quantify because it seems like everybody kind of gets lumped into this behavioral health, mental health. Um, what is the workforce looking like? I know we're talking about referrals and all of that, which 100%. Is it a case where we can refer all day long, but there's simply not staff to go out and do these kind of evaluations? Or what is the kind of workforce looking like in terms of specialists that can help with this?
Well, it's different if it's through a school versus medical. So let's say up in my area, I'm on the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota. So we're a suburb of Minneapolis, St. Paul. I've heard parents there who are medically going to like an autism company to get their child tested, and they could be on a 2 year wait list or a
Wow.
6 month to 2 years, especially for if they're doing like wanting full day treatment, not in a school, but in a clinic. That can be a 2 year wait. Well, then early childhood's over by the time they,
Yeah, right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, schools, though, are public schools. There are timelines and legal mandates that they would have to meet once a child's referred. And
Okay.
once the parents, so they would learn about the child, meet with the parent, come up with what tests they want to do. And once the parents sign, that timeline begins. And they need to have the testing done in a certain number of calendar days and then create an IEP, individualized education plan, and then implement that too. And so at that point, it depends. The services look different state to state, county to county, but for some kids, it might mean, coming into a center like the classroom I had for 3 to 5 year olds, or it could mean they stay in their Head Start program and a special ed teacher comes a certain number of days a week, a speech therapist comes and consults and kind of helps the staff there know better how to meet their needs. And, so the service is completely different in different states and different cities. So that's kind of how the process goes, though. So schools are definitely your best bet to get things moving faster, especially if you're on a wait list somewhere else.
Okay. Well, that's really good to know. I was curious if you'd be able to do kind of like a Mythbusters, like kind of like
Okay.
commonly misconceived
Oh, yeah.
ideas of like
Yeah.
do I grow out of autism? Is it a lifelong thing? Like all these
Yeah.
kind of crazy things that you probably have heard over the years. What are some of the big misconceptions or some of the falsehoods that you kind of hear time and time again that we want to dispel here
Yeah.
today?
Well, since we were going back in history, a myth long ago that's just interesting, and I don't think many people think this anymore, but they used to blame moms for autism, and they said
Hmm.
this was like in the 60s. They actually had a name. They called them refrigerator mothers. And they said their autism was caused by cold, uncaring mothers. And these mothers were the ones that needed therapy. Isn't that, I mean, it's like laughable
Wow.
now because it's so mind-blowing and mind-boggling.
Wow.
But it was like a real thing. And you think, gosh, if there's anyone out there still that believes that, this is 100% myth. So parents, especially moms, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. It's not caused by parenting.
Okay.
Another myth is, like you said, okay, there's certain types of therapy that might say, well, we're going to have him indistinguishable from his peers by kindergarten, or he'll be dismissed from therapy. And autism is a way of thinking. It's the way the brain is wired, and so you don't grow out of it. Now, can an autistic individual like gain skills and live a life on their own, functioning well? Yeah, but autism is lifelong. It's not something you can just get rid of.
Trying to think of some other
I know,
interesting ones
me
I may
too.
have heard over the
We
years.
already busted the myth about vaccines, or at least what we know of them as of this point through studies. Uh, oh gosh. I feel like I need to like Google it or ask GPT because it's like you're in it and then you forget about all those myths.
Well, I
Oh,
mean, I think that's the big one, right? Like able to live
yeah.
quote unquote normal lives or whatever I want to call it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's, and I think that was especially back, you think years ago when parents, that's why I was wondering about the conversation. Parents are like, oh my gosh, I don't want my kid labeled. I don't want to send my kid
Yeah.
to a special school. I don't want to have him be picked on. I don't want to have her be
Yeah.
singled out. Like all that stuff was the stigma, I guess, is what I'm saying. The stigma was
Yeah.
real back, especially you think like the 80s,
Yeah.
um, which is funny. Most people, nowadays you talk to some of the teachers, they're like, "Dad, Andy, I wasn't born in the 80s." Like they
You're
are like
right. It's
the
so fun.
grandpa back in my day. But well,
Yeah, I
speaking
think one of
about,
the things too is that a myth would be that autistic people don't want friends or they lack empathy, and those are untrue too. Just because they don't engage socially with people in a neurotypical way doesn't mean that they don't want to have friends.
well, that's a good one, yeah, for sure. And
Yeah.
speaking of kind of the next generation, I know you had kind of commented at the beginning here. You were, I mean, it is what it is back then, but I mean, I think we'd all say like you were kind of let down. I mean, only having a short class on the topic and not knowing much and kind of getting thrown to the wolves.
Yeah.
A little bit different nowadays, I would like to think. Is it gotten better? Are there more classes, more knowledge, more? I hope.
From what I've heard from special education teachers and speech language pathologists who are newer to the field, they learn about autism, but it's more in like that academic way. You know what I mean? Like
Okay.
college academic way. They learn about it, what it is, but the practical strategies, because like think of a caseload of a special education teacher, SLP, they're gonna have autistic kids on their caseload.
Mhm.
And many special education teachers end up working with a classroom with just autistic kids. So being prepared with actual tips, resources. There's no like one size fits all curriculum out there. Most of us, that's why I started Autism Little Learners, because especially once I got to the early childhood level, I was like, everything I would buy and download and be like, this is going to be such a great resource for my students. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, shoot, I'm going to modify it again. So everything we do, we are creating our own curriculum, modifying any other curriculum that's maybe provided to us because it's not right for our students. And so I started my business not out here doing trainings and things, but by creating resources that actually work for autistic 3 to 5 year olds. They're at the right level so that teachers and educators do not have to reinvent them, remodel them, modify them. And that's one of the big things that I've heard back from people is like, finally, something at the right level. And then now that's just moved on into trainings in the podcast too. And last summer, I had hosted my first ever preschool autism summit, which 33,000 people signed up for.
I
And
love it.
this is because people want information, whether you're an educator, a parent, a caregiver, childcare provider. You want to know what you can do to make your students or your child's life better or their educational experience better. But you want it specific to that preschool level because when we would go to trainings, again, everything would be like elementary or late elementary, and
Mhm.
we'd have to be like, well, my students are 3, and that just is not appropriate or wouldn't work for them. And so providing, it's really important to me now to speak out and provide trainings on topics at that young early childhood level because other people don't get it. Unless you've done it, you don't get it.
Well, and I'm blown away by the community that you've created, and I can't give you enough kudos. Like amazing work. I do. I'm a lurker, I guess, on the
Learn and
Facebook
lurk,
page
lurk and
for.
learn.
I'm learning and I'm lurking. I've been on
Yeah.
there for many years, but what's so it's so cool. Like somebody will be on there and say, I'm trying to think of a recent example. I don't even know. It was well, it always gets really fired up when it's back to school time.
Oh,
That's
yeah. And there's
and
topics, potty
oh,
training,
right. Yeah.
behavior.
School buses, potty
Yep.
training, moving from a different classroom to a new class. I mean,
Yes.
all the things, right? And what I love is, somebody will post something like, I'm looking for this, or I'm having a challenge with this. And it used to be like, I've been around it enough to remember, like, well, we're all sitting. This was back when it was Tara Tershell back in the day
Yeah.
before Tara Phillips. Like, we're waiting. What's she gonna say? What's she gonna retweet? And then, like,
Like I was the one that responded.
100%
And
right.
now it's the collective, which is
Oh my
so
God, it's
much more
amazing.
valuable because I always say I'm not the end all be all for answers. I will research, I will seek out and help people find it, but I don't know everything, right? When it comes to early childhood and autism. But there probably is someone in that group that is in the same exact situation
Oh,
as me that could answer it better than me. And so that collective wisdom is what has been the gold mine in that Facebook community.
yeah, I mean, it's mad. And I often just kind of laugh. I'm like, I bet she hasn't even seen this yet. And when you finally
No,
do log in, there's, 35, 40
yeah,
responses
there's
of
too
all these
many
great.
now.
It's just amazing. So, kudo. I mean, this is something that honestly, it didn't exist until you stepped up and did this. And it's been just so awesome to see the journey. And of
Thank
course,
you.
COVID, you just did so much because look, that COVID disrupted everybody, but I got to think that our autistic friends, I mean,
Mhm.
because it seems to me, and again, I'm no expert, but any child, they like the routine, they like knowing what's coming, they like all this stuff that they can rely on, and of course, all that got thrown out the window.
Yeah,
So I would suspect that our autistic friends got hit even harder than some.
very hard. Yeah.
Um, so thank you for being that resource, and also that just that community. Like, gosh, going from in person to just virtual, it was difficult for a lot of folks, so many of us, and knowing that you weren't alone and just isolated because of the network you created is it's just been really magical to see. So talk a little bit about how folks can engage with you. I know you've got membership stuff, folks, you have special sessions that people can attend. You got newsletters that come. Your newsletters are
Yeah.
phenomenal too, by the way. I read
Oh,
every single word. They're great. They're great resources. So brag a little bit about yourself here. Tell
oh
folks how they
gosh.
can get involved and be part of this awesome community that you've started here.
Well, thank you. That is really, really nice of you. It's hard to I don't know, sometimes when someone else sums up probably what the last 4 years have been like as far as autism little learners, it's it kind of is more like, whoa, I don't think of it that way in myself. I'm in the day and in the moment. And so what looking at it through someone else's eyes is it's pretty neat. But I think the best place to go would be autismlittlelearners.com. And from there, you could sign up to get the weekly newsletter. Sometimes I have freebies in it or stories that you can maybe relate to or trainings that are coming up, whether they're free or paid. So there's that. And then that Facebook group that we were talking about. On the website is also that free story library. And then we have the podcast. I'm on everything as Autism Little Learners. So Instagram, TikTok, the YouTube Autism Little Learners. Just look that up. And the podcast is the Autism Little Learners podcast. So I try to make it really easy to find. I do have, if you start learning from me and you're like, oh, I want to be part of the group, I have a membership for both parents and educators. So special ed teachers, could be Head Start teachers. We are all inclusive of anyone that works with young autistic kids. And you get monthly training that you can watch on your own time on demand, a new resource, a handout that you can share with parents or to train staff. And then we have a coaching call. Our next one is actually tonight, but we have a coaching call once a month where we get on Zoom and you can ask questions and chat with me. And hopefully the collective group also chimes in and helps you leave with some ideas to try.
Well, amazing. And I can't say enough good things. It's been, again, it's just been so wonderful watching all of this grow and how much stuff. And I think I've seen you on, correct me if I'm wrong, Teachers Pay Teachers. Is your stuff on there
Oh,
too?
yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So Teachers Pay Teachers, probably a lot of people in the education world know what that is, but it's a shop. That's where I started, was just creating resources. I had no interest in going on Instagram or TikTok. I thought, I don't want to dance. That's the only thing back then that I thought like, no, that's where people do dances. I don't want to dance. But I am on there demonstrating how to use some of these resources now. But on Teachers Pay Teachers, there's well over 500 products. So, if you needed something for a certain theme or strategy, you could grab those there. And it's Autism Little Learners. And all of those are in my membership. So people that are like, oh, I want to buy this and this and this, the membership is a cheaper way to do that.
Oh, excellent. Well, there you go. We all love frugal. We love cheap, right?
Right? Exactly.
Well, I can't say enough about just how thankful I am that our paths have crossed over the years, and how proud I am of all the wonderful work that you're doing. You're really making a big difference, and I'm happy to call you a colleague and a friend, and very happy we finally got to meet in person. It's been
I know.
crazy, but we had a pretty good time. We were at a mental health conference down in Puerto Rico, and had a lot of good conversation there about mental health and challenging situations, and how to handle those. And you did a fantastic job, man. We had you up there with the Mayo Clinic and Sesame Street and so many other great folks. And there we were, Autism Little Learners, right there in front and center. So thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I really do appreciate it. Keep up the awesome work that you're doing. And certainly, if folks want to get a hold of you, Autism Little Learners website is probably the best.
Yeah.
And of course, you're on socials and all that. I
Yeah.
don't do TikTok. I'm gonna have to figure that out. I want to see you dancing on there or whatever.
I don't think I've done any dances.
Well, thank you very much again for being with us. And of course, thank everybody for listening here. It's again, we're in season 2 now. So we've made it for gosh, we appreciate all the support we've gotten. And certainly if there's other topics that you'd like to talk about, let us know. We're always looking for new and interesting things that we can get the word out on, and special guests with awesome expertise. So please drop us a line, let us know, and thank you so much for listening. So I guess we'll wrap it up and say thank you very much. This is Andy with the Early Childhood Chats podcast, and we will see you on the next podcast. Bye, everybody.